Careful. Be careful. Be careful. This entire video contains spoilers for the first 3 Silent Hill games, as well as content warnings for abuse and all kinds of stuff, really. I haven't released a video for a while because I've had a lot of stuff happen in the interim. Long story short, I'm now the caretaker of a property deep in the mountains. I tell you this because my voice might be a little messed up because I've been living in an area under evacuation warning due to a forest fire that's like 3 miles away. Every night I can see the embers glowing up on the mountains in the distance. And every day I breathe what feels like more smoke than oxygen. I'm sorry for any oral inconvenience this might cause. There's a common element to most horror media. It involves being drawn into either a situation or location where you might never be able to go home again, or a situation where your home itself is transformed into something alien and menacing. However it's framed, the idea is to take the characters out of their safe, cozy space and transplant them into a situation that inspires anxiety and fear in both the characters and the audience. My favorite twist on this plot device is when it isn't the character trapped in a location far from home, or home being transformed into a hostile environment. It's when the character is so changed by the events of the story that they no longer belong wherever home used to be. They've ceased to be the person who inhabited the space. Heather Mason's version of this journey begins with a nightmare she has in a fast food restaurant. Surprisingly, not the one I keep having, involving the Hamburglar doing unspeakable things to Grimace at the quiet direction of a shifty-fingered, vacant-eyed Ronald. When she wakes up, she can sense that something has shifted, but she has no idea that her life has just changed forever. That even though she will soon set foot in her apartment again, it will have ceased to be her home. She will never be home again. Sometimes it happens that fast. Critically important decisions are being made out of your sight. There's an entire universe full of unknowable machinations operating in the background, unbeknownst to you. The problem with losing your stability is the idea that you don't know if you're going to be able to pick yourself back up again. Sometimes the forces at work will simply pull you down into oblivion with them. You have to produce enough strength to get back up and keep walking. If this is, say, the 5th time fate has kicked your feet out from under you, you may not see the point anymore and just stay down. Why rebuild something that's only going to be destroyed again and again? After all, you cannot win long against the constant forces of entropy inherent in the universe. The answer, of course, is that it's simply in our nature to continue screaming into the darkness, regardless of whether or not such screaming is capable of producing new light. The fear of the unknown here takes what is, in my opinion, its most ghastly and insidious form. My greatest fear, in fact, simply put, an uncertain future. This would be Heather Mason's first experience with the wind being stolen from her sails, and having to forge a new path alone back into some semblance of stability. It's fairly common for a person's first jaunt into dealing with the life they knew being blown apart and having to come to grips with a new, unknown future to be referred to as coming of age. And much has been written on Silent Hill 3 essentially being a young woman's coming of age story. It certainly spotlights some very female anxieties right out the gate, such as dodging creepy old men in public places, feeling like your own reflection is an alien and perhaps hostile force, and of course the classic, wondering where all the mysterious blood came from. I've never been a woman, but I'd imagine the game is quite accurate in depicting the feeling of spending half your time avoiding or fighting off monsters shaped like... You know what? My friend Janella's visiting. Why not let her weigh in?
As a woman, half your time is spent either avoiding or fighting off the advances of creepy, unwashed dick monsters. Ew.
Thank you, Janelle. Most media written about Silent Hill 3 throughout the years centers around the symbolic menstruation and motherhood angles. It's been done to death, so it will not be the focus of this video. But it would be negligent of me to not at least mention it in passing. It's a huge theme, and no analysis would be complete or even competent without it. As I said, Silent Hill was beginning to draw Heather Mason in, as it does, with a rust and blood-soaked nightmare about an unfamiliar amusement park. One with still, bloodied bunny mascots and strange creatures hunting her. Pretty weird as dreams go, but... What's that, Ronald? But you're not my daddy, Ronald. I don't want to do the pose again, Ronald. No, I won't calm down and eat another burger. You don't tell me what to... Sorry, moving on. She's far from the first person to be drawn into the town. The series is full of such unlucky souls, but she's arguably the most important quarry of this sprawling spider in the unlikely form of a small municipality. It's a trap that outwardly appears as little more than a dusty cobweb, until it suddenly changes. Sometimes with the wail of an otherworldly air raid siren. Heather isn't a tortured soul with darkness in her heart, that she knows of anyway, like the town's other impromptu residents. Despite her true heritage, this iteration of her is an innocent teenager. The town doesn't need to manipulate deep-seated guilt or trauma to draw her in, however. It just tugs at her spiritual bond with the town. If Heather Mason truly has a birth parent, it's the town of Silent Hill. She was born here, reincarnated on the spot from the spirits of Alessa Gillespie and Cheryl Mason at the end of the first game. The corrupted town cannot be a home to her, though. Silent Hill is a place of reckonings, a counting of sums, a dark promise or a promised darkness. It's home only to the malevolent things that want to be birthed from it. A hole to somewhere else that things from both sides attempt to crawl in and out from. Its function seems to be to draw in new pain and hatred, so it can push old, unknowable things out with fresh reservoirs of power. We will get to what the town of Silent Hill wants from Heather in time, but it will shatter the only home, the only life she's ever known in the wake of its calling. Silent Hill, like many of the characters we're about to be introduced to, does not care about Heather Mason, only what ends it can use her for. Stephen King has an interesting term that I think is extremely applicable to the town of Silent Hill. This term is thinny, or a place where the barriers that separate different worlds are thinner than usual, allowing some things to pass through and affect the adjacent plane. The Native Americans that lived in the region that would become Maine knew it was there, and to them it was a place of power where they performed ritual magic. The few existing descriptions of these times makes it seem like the true nature of the region wasn't always a dark and malevolent thing, but was slowly transformed by hatred and human suffering throughout the years. First came a plague that killed many, then a penal colony was built on the land that killed countless more. Yet people were always drawn back to the blood-stained land. Eventually, some of these people came to recognize it for what it was, and built a religious order around it, intent on drawing out the power they believed inhabited whatever lies on the opposite side of the thinny. To them, it was God, and they created an entire mythology surrounding this new deity. Some thought to use the power to attain their own ends, like those in league with Alessa's mother, Dahlia Gillespie, who used a ritual to draw the god into her daughter's womb, but also ended up both burning her and splitting the girl's soul in half, thus setting into motion the events of the first game. Others at least claim to have less selfish but still obviously misguided ideas, like Alessa's friend Claudia Wolf, the antagonist of Silent Hill 3. Claudia spent years trying to find her friend's reincarnation because the fetal image of God was reborn along with Alessa, and the girl that housed the second half of her soul, Harry Mason's adopted daughter, Cheryl. She was hunting Heather Mason, but told herself that she didn't intend to use God's power selfishly, but rather grant salvation to a world Claudia despised. She wanted to use Heather to bring about a paradise for all mankind. I believe Claudia was lying to herself and really just wanted her friend back, but I'll get into that a bit later. She eventually found Heather in a shopping mall after enlisting the help of a private detective, and began the series of events that comprise Silent Hill 3. I don't own a PS1 or the first game, so I watched a full playthrough to prepare for this video. Can't very well cover the sequel to a game you've never at least seen being played. I've previously played Silent Hill 2, and it's one of my favorite games. I also read the Book of Lost Memories, and obviously played through the third game. If you've seen either of my previous videos, you know I spend a great deal of time researching these things before writing about them, and pride myself on a certain attention to detail. That said, Silent Hill is a beast of a series. The lore is often cryptic and vague, and even the Book of Lost Memories is written in a way that seems intentionally left open to personal interpretation at times. If you believe I've gotten something wrong, you're probably right. Feel free to tell me about it in the comments section. While you're down there, please subscribe and like or dislike however you see fit. This is a brand new channel, still trying to reach even basic monetization, and every bit of engagement with my content helps me out greatly, even if it's just telling me off. After Heather's nightmare, she is immediately approached by an older gentleman named Donald, the PI that Claudia hired. After a brief interaction where she makes it clear she wants nothing to do with him or whatever he wants from her, Heather dodges him by entering the women's restroom in the mall, which is pretty much the only place she could go and be relatively sure he wouldn't follow. Here she has her first encounter with a mysterious symbol. It's familiar to Heather, but she doesn't quite know why yet. Only that it creeps her out and makes her head hurt. Mechanically, these symbols function as save spots in the game. They unsettle Heather, but likely renew the player's hope by functioning as tangible markers of progress. It's one interesting contrast in a series full of them. She climbs through the bathroom window, successfully evading Donald in the process, but also enters the last few moments of normalcy she's going to know for quite some time, if not forever. This is an invisible line of demarcation that, once crossed, signals a dramatic change in the life of this young woman. Once she finds her way back inside the mall, she notices that it's suddenly empty. These are the back halls that are generally used by store employees and other staff like janitors. Even if the mall was closing, you'd still expect to see signs of life back here, so she's correct in thinking it a bit eerie when she's suddenly completely alone. She enters a clothing store and the last remaining vestige of normalcy slips away from her as she slides underneath the half-closed security gate. She notices a pistol inexplicably lying on the ground and picks it up before advancing further into the shop. A creature called a closer, one of the things from her nightmare, is in here, feasting on a human body. Its hulking, inhuman form shifts towards her and she fires the pistol over and over again into its body until it finally slumps forward and dies, leaving Heather in a very reasonable state of shock. What just happened? Moments ago, she was a normal teenager in a normal mall dodging some creepy old guy, as one does. Now she's suddenly Heather Mason, Monster Slayer. She adapts to her new normal shockingly fast, however, and proceeds deeper into the mall, which is now infested with various bizarre and deformed creatures, including dogs with split open double heads, and numb bodies, the aforementioned creatures that have the appearance of male genitalia. She searches the surrounding hallways and any rooms that are unlocked, defeating or dodging monsters as she goes, until finding her way into a bookstore. After completing the first puzzle of the game, she finds herself face to face with someone whom she doesn't yet recognize as her oldest friend, Claudia Wolf. Claudia begins to tell her about her ideas of paradise and that she's needed to lead them there with blood-stained hands, but soon realizes that Heather doesn't remember who she once was. Their meeting triggers a gigantic headache that brings Heather to her knees as she clutches at her head in agony. Claudia just kinda walks off. Heather wanders around a bit more until she finds a functioning elevator, and once she goes down, something, either Claudia or Heather or the two of them meeting again, triggers the Otherworld from Silent Hill, which reconfigures reality itself. Something drops the iconic Silent Hill radio into the elevator car, and she soon witnesses a series of disturbing visions, including seeing a strange and disturbing creature with a twitchy head watching her. Was it he who dropped the radio? In this first jaunt into the rustier side of the game, Heather is presented with a few more puzzles and a couple of cryptic echoes of her previous identity. Most notably, a snowy TV through which she can hear a hazy voice crying out, "Daddy!" which is nearly identical to a scene from the mall section found in the first game. She finally finds her way to an impossibly long ladder that leads her to the first boss fight, a gigantic worm with a split head that's based on the first boss encounter in Silent Hill 1. The tactic to defeat it is the same in both. Wait until the worm opens its split head wide and start popping off rounds. I was still getting reacclimated to tank controls and very nearly ran out of ammo during this fight. And yeah, I can't imagine trying to kill this thing with a length of pipe or a pocket knife, so save your ammo, kids. It's a survival horror game. Heather really was a pretty unique character for the period in gaming history that she emerged from. There were precious few female protagonists at the time, and most of them were presented in a hyper-sexualized fashion. Heather, by comparison, was simply a teenage girl with a mysterious past she couldn't quite remember, trapped in a situation she didn't understand and was woefully unprepared to deal with. She gets into the swing of capping monsters quickly enough, but at least initially comes off as a pretty normal person. Again, there have been entire articles and other videos written explicitly to sing the praises of putting a mostly normal human female in the starring role of a video game, and I don't feel the need to rehash it here. but they're right. It was actually pretty rare, and the game's sales probably did suffer from it, so it deserves to be mentioned. A lot of what makes Heather a good character, in my opinion, is just that. She's a normal person put into a horrible situation that she's completely unprepared for. I think she's a genuinely likable character with several strong personality traits. I'll try to bring them up as we encounter them. Some of her reactions and clapbacks are just mwah. That aside, she's also a containment unit for a mysterious god. In my opinion, one of the best ways to look at Heather is through the perspective of Valtiel, the twitchy-headed guy from the elevator, and God's valet, as it were. He follows her around throughout the game, resurrecting her when she dies, and twisting valves meant to symbolize the cyclical nature of time and rebirth. According to the Book of Lost Memories, Valtiel is what actually ties the first 3 games together. In Silent Hill 1, he's represented by ceremonial robes that Harry finds hanging from walls, mostly throughout the school portion of the game. In their low-res form, these robes looked more like bound bodies suspended in the air, and kinda wonder if that's not exactly what they were initially, but were retconned as the series and its lore developed game by game. In the second game, he's none other than Pyramid Head himself, symbolizing James's subconscious urge to be punished for his crime. Seen through Heather's eyes, he's this weird twitchy dude that crawls around watching her as she progresses, making sure she ultimately reaches her destination. His role here is to make sure Heather plays her part in the birthing of God. Let's make one thing explicitly clear about Valtiel. He doesn't care one lick about Heather, or anyone else, including Claudia. His sole function is to facilitate the birth of the god, and he will go to whatever lengths necessary to make it happen. Heather isn't special to him. She's just a vessel meant to carry the deity until such a time as it can be brought into the world. He doesn't hurt Heather. He will drag her off and resurrect her if necessary, but he sure as hell won't lift a finger to help her escape her situation or fight Claudia. In certain ways, the player is similar. We're trying to help her survive and get through this ordeal after all. We, not unlike Valtiel, help guide her on her journey and resurrect her every time we start the game or reload a save when we screw up and get her killed. But unlike Valtiel, we directly help her fight her foes. So, in Valtiel's eyes, if Heather is simply a vessel, a jar to carry the fetal god from point A to point B, why do I think Valtiel is a useful lens through which to view Heather? Because a vessel or tool is basically how all the characters in the game that are associated with the cult view her. Claudia doesn't care about Heather. She doesn't seem to see her as the same person as her old friend. She's simply a vessel, a tool that she can use to bring her childhood friend Alessa back in the form of God. To Vincent, who will be introduced a little later, she's just a means to an end, a thing he can use to twist the outcome in his favor. He doesn't want to bring God into existence, but to him, she's nevertheless more of a useful tool than an actual human being with intrinsic value of her own. These characters stand in contrast to characters like Harry Mason, her loving father, or Donald, the private eye who ends up on her side after discovering his employer's true purposes, or the player who hopefully develops a fondness for her over the course of the game. Again, in my opinion, there's a lot to like about her personality-wise. I certainly like her more than either of the game's previous protagonists. From our point of view, the god she's carrying inside her is a problem to be solved, something to get rid of so Heather can return to some semblance of normal life. The player must struggle with the fact that we know deep down that's impossible, even if we defeat the very creepy set of challenges arrayed against her. After all, she'll never be home again. As the Book of Lost Memories points out, there are several important contrasts present in the series, and a few that are just interesting, like the save spots being creepy to Heather but are relieving of tension for the player. In the first game, Harry and his selfless search for his adopted daughter is contrasted by Dahlia's selfish lust for power and absolute willingness to sacrifice her child in service of her own ends. It's also worth noting that Cheryl is Harry's adopted daughter, whereas Alessa is Dahlia's flesh and blood. Heather holds the memories of 3 people inside her, but for the entire first half of Silent Hill 3, she can't remember anything but tiny snippets of her past lives. She might recognize the save game symbols as being from the altar, but has no idea what altar or what significance it holds for her. For half of the game, she's just Heather Mason, teenager who was trying to do some shopping at the mall until things went completely sideways. Once she remembers her past lives as Alyssa and Cheryl, she's still Heather, just also those other things. However, the reemergence of these memories is enough to change her on such a fundamental level that she realizes that she doesn't really belong anywhere. She's lost the bit of ignorance that let her feel at home in an apartment with her dad. Her perspective, her scope, dramatically widens, but at a very high personal cost. If Heather is a good protagonist, Claudia is a great antagonist. She's miles away from a stereotypical video game villain, and it's hard not to feel bad for her once her motivations and history become a bit clearer. A little bit later, I'm gonna depart from most of the analysis I've heard about Claudia, but keep in mind, I'm not married to the idea. Like Dark Souls lore, I think there's room for multiple interpretation. It's certainly left vague enough to get a bit creative. I don't think Claudia only wanted to bring forth a god to wipe the slate clean and grant the world salvation. I think, at least subconsciously, she wanted to bring back her only friend and grant herself salvation. We'll really start to dissect Claudia as she makes more appearances, but thought it might be nice to have that little tidbit to chew on for a while in advance. After defeating the giant worm with the split head, Heather finds herself suddenly returned to reality where she encounters Donald once again. Creepy dude was still waiting for her to come out of the bathroom, apparently. He also experienced the shift into the other world and saw the creatures, which he didn't assist us with killing despite having a pistol of his own. Pfft, Donald. The two argue for a few moments before Heather decides she's done with him and the whole thing and is gonna take the subway home. There we encounter the first original Silent Hill level of the game, the empty subway system. This is a pretty decent approximation of a subway system and still comes off creepier than the mall, somehow. Despite being a little harder to navigate, I think the subway is one of the creepier early game locations. There's also an exercise in the fine art of missed opportunities. It's implied that someone jumped in front of a subway train and haunts the area, occasionally pushing a victim onto the rails. But after Heather gets shoved into the tracks, it's completely forgotten about and never mentioned again, let alone explored further. Mr. Push-A-Man gets no cameo, and that disappointed me. This is also the first place that I really noticed the sound in music design. The music is ear-splitting anxiety poison, and as a fan of even the more nonsensical industrial music like Skinny Puppy, I kinda love it, despite it making me want to stick as many earwigs as I can find into my brain to make the bad thoughts go away. The only problem I have with it is it ends and doesn't start back up if you take too long, which can take the tension out of a few boss fights if you don't kill them before the track ends. You also find the shotgun just kinda abandoned in a subway car down here. Apparently finding guns just lying around in the series is a shot at the whole gun obsession thing in the US. Later, you ride a different subway car all the way to an unknown station, setting Heather up for fights in some tight quarters, which is where Silent Hill combat gets really stressful. Oddly, there weren't any of the monsters called closers in here, even though they seem made for such environments. If you try to go back to the previous subway car, you find out that the previous car has vanished, and if you're not quick on the uptake and try to walk forward again, you fall off the car onto the speeding rails to your death. Just kind of a nice touch, no running back to a save spot for Heather here. Eventually you reach the car that triggers the train to stop and disembark into my least favorite portion of the game. The forgotten station that quickly just turns into sewers. Sewers have always been a bit of a meme in video game communities. It sometimes feels like a good 80% of games have a sewer level. I've taken to calling it the Civvy Special. I hope you'll pardon me kinda rushing through this one. It doesn't have anything particularly special or exciting about it. The only interesting thing I found down there was some kind of unique monster that seems to exist in the real world, as in not manifested by someone's delusions or anxieties intermingling with Silent Hill's otherworld. There's a letter on the desk here from a man claiming that his best friend had been killed by this thing and he was going in to get some of that sweet, sweet vengeance pie. It doesn't seem to have gone too well for him though, as Heather has to kill the thing by dropping a hairdryer into the water and frying it. All you see of it is a tentacle that floats to the surface as Heather walks past. Once Heather escapes the stupid sewer, she finds herself in a few sections of abandoned buildings. The first bit is still under construction, the second bit consists of empty offices and various businesses. There's some good creepiness to be had here. You find someone's corpse sealed up in the walls, cask of Amontillado style. Ominously, there's an empty squatter's den nearby, complete with the quiet stench of desperation wafting up from a silent army of empty booze bottles. After dropping a crusty mattress down a hole, from here you can jump down into the next area where you find, of all things, a freaking mannequin shop, with a storage area filled with headless mannequins. Except one. One had a head, but then this happens. You go through an art gallery, a mechanic shop, a dance studio, find a katana, then a furniture store where you find a bathroom that triggers the otherworld once Heather interacts with it, for some reason. Once the implied arterial spray is done coating the floors, walls, and every other conceivable surface, the real fun begins. You immediately stumble onto, well, whatever this thing is, and then a body hanging from the ceiling clutching a baby doll that's obviously supposed to be Valtiel. Once you gain access to a medical office, you're finally introduced to Vincent, another member of the Order who knows what's going on and what Claudia wants. He claims to be on Heather's side, but refuses to help her stop whatever's transpiring, so Heather leaves him to his own devices, telling him there's
something wrong with you, too.
The rest of the area is centered around finding the missing pages of a fairy tale. You find the beginning of the story in front of this unspeakable horror that's blocking the exit, and wander through various rooms and hallways solving little puzzles in order to gather the last remaining pages that give you a magical spell to speak that makes the gurgling obstruction as well as the other world itself vanish once spoken. Once you've read the words aloud, you can just kinda mosey on out of the building and onto the very normal streets outside the back of Heather's apartment building. Returning to the character we've just been introduced to, I have a few, notes? Oddly enough, graffiti depicting the word friends adorns the wall behind Heather when we first meet the strange man known as Vincent. It's hard to take anything seen in the otherworld at face value because the setting is almost always patterned after one or more characters' delusions. Vincent becomes agitated when Heather asks if he's with Claudia, revealing some kind of bad blood between them. Apparently Claudia was brainwashed by the Order and Dahlia, Alessa's mother. Little concrete information is revealed here, only that Vincent had an entirely different impression of the otherworld and the events transpiring within it. When Heather asks him to help her stop whatever's happening, he says not yet. When pressed, he reveals that he finds the goings-on to be quite interesting. At which point Heather, convinced of his untrustworthiness, decides to leave the room and continue her exploration of the abandoned building. This is a vague, cryptic character introduction, even by Silent Hill standards, and sets Vincent up to be the wild card of the game quite nicely. We simply do not know where this man stands or what his true motivations could possibly be. Yet. After escaping the abandoned building, Heather wanders the street behind her apartment for a few minutes. There's little to be said about this area as it's mostly just a piece of connective tissue funneling us from one setting to another. I only bring it up here because of the way they block off both ends of the street with walls of scaffolding and construction materials. It just kinda made me wonder what the city could possibly be doing that would necessitate about a city block worth of street to be isolated in such a way. You'd never even notice it if you just went from point A to B like you're supposed to, but of course I ended up exploring it. The Silent Hill series is known for its weird Easter eggs, and I thought there might be a chance of some of that sweet action. Heather's quest so far has been relatively simple. Return home to her father and likely ask him what the hell's going on. Unfortunately, Claudia beat her to the apartment and Harry was already dead. Her safety and comfort destroyed in her absence. Her future suddenly rendered both meaningless and inconceivable. What follows is, to me, one of the sadder moments in gaming. She enters the apartment, spots him sitting in his chair in front of the TV, back turned to her. She approaches gingerly, trying to broach the subject of her insane evening, then goes from puzzlement to traumatic shock and finally tremendous loss and grief in a fluid series of seconds. I was reminded of moments of profound loss I have experienced myself as she collapsed to her knees in front of him and hid her face in his lap one final time. This is the moment I've been alluding to throughout this video. The moment where she realizes that home was never a place or destination. Home was wherever she was with her dad, and home was now irretrievably gone. Stolen, moved beyond her grasp. She made it back to her apartment, but she will never be home again. It's not anger or sadness that moved the stories of our lives forward toward finality, as if propelled by the squeaky wheels of a rusty hospital gurney, but loss. Loss is something profoundly felt, but usually quickly consumed by a different, lesser emotion. The loss itself, lost, pushed away before we can be sucked down into its endless depths and consumed ourselves. I think hysteria has too much of a pointed history to be used in the context of this story, but it's either a feeling like that or unbridled rage that comes to rescue us from the suction of the endless abyss of loss that exists where our hearts once did. Heather has no time for hysteria. She notices a set of blood droplets leading out onto her patio and a set of stairs that leads up to the roof of her apartment building and follows them. A boundless fire rapidly spreading in her brain, eating away the remains of any logic she might have possessed before her loss. Rage and displacement abolished it. She finds Claudia on the roof of the building that she once called home, who explains that she killed Harry not only to avenge his part in the event 17 years ago, but to fill Heather's heart with hatred. Yeah, just having a normal one. The God that dwells inside of her feeds on negative emotions, just as the version of God that came from Alessa fed on the negative emotions of the town, which was then harvested by the otherworld Alessa brought into existence in Silent Hill 1. The thing inside of Heather is seemingly fed by pain and hatred, fear and sadness. So that's what Claudia believes she must impart. She murdered Harry because she knew it would fill Heather's heart with a deep and nourishing hatred towards her, and at least for now, it worked. Having more work to do and trying to get Heather to come back to Silent Hill, she points to someone she brought with her, known as the Missionary, saying that he was the one who killed Harry. She merely gave the order. She leaves Heather to deal with this transformed follower, saying only that she'll be waiting for Heather in Silent Hill. The Missionary looks like a disfigured monster to Heather, who quickly shotguns it down and proceeds back inside to deal with her father's body. She finds Donald the PI inside, completely flabbergasted, realizing that he had been used for a nefarious purpose that he, even now, barely understands. Alessa blames him, and he doesn't disagree with her. He offers to drive her to Silent Hill, and is oddly unconcerned when Heather reminds him that he might die too, saying that there isn't anyone to cry over his grave anyway. I think the events have drained the man of any further will to live, and this way he can possibly make amends for his part in the situation, the profound loss that's transpired. If you aren't familiar with the events of Silent Hill 1, you might be wondering who this Harry Mason guy was. In a word, annoying. In 2 words, ridiculously annoying. But he did successfully get an Impossibaby baby out of Deathtown and raise her into Heather, so maybe it was just his US voice actor that sucked. Even at the end, when he was battling someone's concept of God, he seemed like the kind of guy that hit you with a no matter what, or even what the. Besides that, well, he was the protagonist of the first Silent Hill. I'm not going to recap the entire plot of Silent Hill 1 here, but Silent Hill 3 is a direct sequel to the first game. I'll keep it brief. Harry loses his adopted daughter Cheryl in Silent Hill following a traffic accident and spends like 99% of the game searching for her. With me so far? Great. At the end of the game, it's revealed that Cheryl was what happened when Alessa was burnt alive, but survived, during a ritual her mother was performing. Her soul split in half and became an actual second human being somehow. Harry and his then-alive wife found the half-a-girl and just took her home. I guess they never wondered where she came from or why no one ever came looking for her. No face on any milk cartons, nothing. Cheryl ran off after the car accident, was eventually reunited with and reabsorbed by Alessa. This let her mother, the one who performed the ritual that burned Alessa but also put a fetal god in her womb, perform the ritual that would bring God into this world. Things don't go exactly as planned, yada yada, but the god that Alessa's mother Dahlia delusioned herself up was brought forth anyway. And promptly killed by Harry. I guess Dahlia had a lack of imagination or something? Not much of a god. Anyway, after Harry, I'm not kidding, just shoots this flying, electricity-hurling god to death, an image of Alessa appears one last time holding a baby that is the reincarnation of herself as well as Cheryl, who of course developed her own memories and life experiences apart from Alessa after their souls split. She hands this baby to Harry, who leaves the town and goes on the run with it. Claudia Wolf was Alessa's best friend, an adherent of the game's cult named The Order, that was run by Alessa's homicidal, child-burning mother Dahlia. Yes, The Order is probably the laziest cult name ever. Couldn't even be bothered to tell you what it was the order of. Was it something like the Order of Delusions and Child Sacrifice? Only order I want to hear about involves cheesy bread. There, you should be all caught up for the second half of Silent Hill 3. Oh, Heather is literally the Impossibaby 17 years later, if you somehow haven't connected those pretty important dots on your own. I guess I also could have just played you this.
Something terrible happened in Silent Hill 17 years ago. A woman named Dahlia. She tried to summon the ancient god of the town. She offered up her very own daughter.
That's crazy.
Maybe so, but it worked. The girl gave birth to a god.
Huh?
You see, the girl had special powers.
Powers?
Her classmates called her a witch. She can make things happen with her mind. She could kill people just by wishing for it. But in the end, that god was killed by a single person. My father, Harry Mason.
There is a fairly respectable roster of horrifying, sometimes genitalia resembling monsters that appear, drip-fed to us as the game progresses. But there already exists ample documentation of them, both in the form of several other videos exploring the reasons and implications involved in their resemblance to various genitalia. They also each have what I describe as somewhat disappointingly short write-ups in the Book of Lost Memories, which you can find a link to in the description. Included is a bestiary for every game, but again, it's disappointingly short and generally quite vague. The main reason I'm not going to dive into each in depth, however, is that this video is already becoming way too long and I'm like halfway done. What I really want to talk about in regards to the creatures found within Silent Hill 3 is, if the otherworld turns fears and delusions into walking nightmares, whose fear and delusions is the otherworld feeding on? Heather's? Claudia's? Both of them? It seems like most think it's Heather's fears and general issues concerning womanhood, but all of those reasons would honestly apply to Claudia too. Claudia, who was abused by her father and brainwashed by Alessa's mother. Claudia, who was raised believing that paradise and salvation were but one god summoning away from becoming reality. I'd also be surprised if Claudia had even a single healthy idea or attitude towards human sexuality related to her at any point throughout her life. We can only guess at the level of delusion, frustration, and sadness this woman's mind was filled with. Her father is a freaking boss monster who intends to kill her after he's done with Heather. Woman's gotta be lousy with daddy issues. In the Book of Lost Memories entry for the missionary, the thing Claudia commanded to kill Harry, it says that he was a cult member transfigured by Claudia's power. To Heather's eyes, the appearance it takes is that of a monster. This entry seems to indicate that Claudia has the ability to transfigure, but Heather sees these transfigured things through her own lens, as it were, through a filter of her own fears, anxieties, and delusions. I take this to mean that Claudia is the one who manifests the otherworld, and whoever's subjected to it has their own baggage projected back at them. Claudia has a way to manifest the Thinny found in Silent Hill, wherever she wants, and onto whomever she wants. She used this power to transfigure the missionary and use him to kill Harry, but we see him as a monster through Heather's eyes, her lens, after having just learned that he was the one who killed her father. Alessa was capable of manifesting the otherworld, so the power is doubtlessly buried deep in Heather's subconscious, and I'm sure Claudia can bring it out of her. But the entry does specifically say that Claudia has a power and that it can transfigure people. During their first meeting, Heather asks Claudia if she's responsible for the creatures she's been seeing, and Claudia responds by saying that they've come to witness the birth of the god and the creation of paradise. The second game also makes it clear that Alessa isn't the only person who can bring forth the otherworld, as all the characters with darkness in their souls we're introduced to in that game seem to have their own versions. They can even see each other's monsters, as made clear by James killing the abstract daddy, which was clearly something from Angela's past. Lots of people can bring on the otherworld, and Claudia seems to be able to inflict it on people who aren't physically within Silent Hill. It's just that they see what's in their subconscious mind, or what they feel guilty about, or are terrified of. It makes sense that an isolated teenage girl who spent most of her life on the lam with her father and has just been told that she's pregnant with God would be confused, if not terrified, of human sexuality, and thus see the creatures as symbolic representations of such. After Donald and Heather arrive in the town of Silent Hill, he leaves her in a hotel room telling her to go check out the hospital. Instead of running right there, I decided to explore the town a little bit, and visited Heaven's Night, the strip club seen in the second game. Despite finding this location, the rest of Silent Hill felt more akin to the version seen in the first game, which makes sense, it's a direct sequel. After the largely focused and linear locations previously visited, it was a nice change of pace to be able to run around in the iconic fog, dodging barely seen monsters and trying to find various landmarks. Once I got to the hospital, it occurred to me, this had been a location in each game up to this point. All three have their similarities and differences. One good example of this is the nurses. They're the main enemies encountered in the hospital in each game, but they all look entirely different. This is of course because all three protagonists have different fears, anxieties, and delusions, so see different kinds of nurses. The nurses James sees are a result of sexual frustration that's built up since he lost his wife, and it wouldn't make sense for a grown man to see the same nurses as a teenage girl. Of course, this makes it extra frustrating when later games just kinda glossed over this nuance and started implanting Pyramid Head into games because he was popular. The non-Team Silent games are an entirely different animal in my eyes. Maybe I'll do a video on them and why most people, including myself, don't even consider them canon one of these days. For me, the series stops at the fourth game, and everything past that was just shameless cash grabs and fan service, a way to milk a few extra dirty dollars out of a popular franchise. The hospital is an iconic and memorable location in each game that it appears in, and this version is no different. Especially once the Otherworld comes into play, we start getting some of the creepiest set pieces of the game. This completely missable room with a wall mirror is also a personal favorite. There are these creepy diary entries from a mysterious man named Stanley who seems to be obsessed with Heather that act kind of like signposts or hints. It's left up to the player's imagination to decide if he was a real patient or just a subconscious manifestation of Heather's anxieties about strange men and the dangers they could potentially represent. Heather also receives a pair of exceptionally creepy phone calls while here. One from Cynthia's father Leonard, who initially mistakes Heather for his daughter, revealing a bit about their toxic relationship, as well as one from a mysterious person who alternates between clownish and predatory voices, as they wish Heather a happy birthday, despite Heather's insistence that it's not actually her birthday. The same voice calls Leonard a murderer and says that Stanley is underground now and known as Number 7. A puzzle a little later involves several gurneys with numbered bodies on them. This would seem to imply that Leonard has killed each of these people, and that the gurney marked with Number 7 holds Stanley's body. According to the Book of Lost Memories, the two different ages the man with the clownish voice congratulates Heather on reaching are different ways to add up the different ages of the three people her soul consists of, but this goes right over Heather's head. At one point she interacts with a symbol similar to the one that marks a save spot, but different. This one doesn't make her head hurt and causes her to see a memory of Lisa's, the nurse from the first game. Heather actually remembers who Lisa was, a sign that her memories as Alessa are indeed coming back to her. The Otherworld seems to be much more powerful while accessed in its hometown rather than taken abroad. Valtiel is also seen assaulting a couple of the nurses, except these nurses appear far more human-like than the ones stalking Heather through the rooms and hallways. This reminds us that despite never attacking Heather personally, Valtiel isn't a friend or ally. He's actively reflecting her anxieties back at her, just like the rest of Silent Hill. Heather eventually makes her way to the sewer below the hospital where she finds Leonard, who, like the missionary, is seen through Heather's eyes as a kind of inhuman monster. The Book of Lost Memories confirms that he too has been transfigured, and holds the form he's seen in either as a result of Claudia's hatred of him or Heather's fear. This would seem to indicate that it's not just Heather's subconscious creating the monster she sees, but rather a combination of Claudia and Heather's subconscious acting upon the Thinny that is the town's underworld. After Heather defeats Leonard, he drops a strange talisman that bears the same symbol that, when interacted with, caused her to relive one of Lisa the nurse's memories a little earlier in the hospital sequence. As events transpire, there is a noticeable shift in Heather's demeanor and, dare I say, confidence levels as we progress through the locations and her memories are gradually restored. She seems downright cocky at times, especially during and after the fight with Leonard. Like the player, she seems to be acclimating to the horrors that surround her. As we grow more confident with the tank controls and combat mechanics, she grows more confident in her quest for revenge. There's a cutscene directly after the Leonard fight that fills a ton of gaps in very little time. Claudia is scolding Victor for sending Heather to find Leonard. She's telling him that he'll go to hell and never see paradise and blah blah religious zealot stuff, when he suddenly starts putting giant, meaty, word-sized holes into her with his mouth gun. Or he yells at her about some pretty personal stuff, if you prefer your ear food to be less gibberish.
You hated your father, didn't you? I saw the way he hit you, kicked you, and made you cry.
Victor tells her that he doesn't want paradise because he knows about the pleasures of this world and wants to find happiness on Earth. He goes on to accuse Claudia of hating her father because, and I know, this is a real shocker, the murderous psycho Heather just killed in some kind of sewer pipe 2 minutes ago wasn't a great father and kinda screwed Claudia up. Another, more accurate way to put it would be that he was an incredibly physically and emotionally abusive father, and Claudia definitely developed multiple personality disorders, causing her to become increasingly unstable and delusional throughout the years, gradually substituting her weird faith for the affection she never got from her father, and was further denied when Alessa died and was reincarnated as Heather. This is why Claudia doesn't see Heather as Alessa. To her, Heather and Harry are simply the things that took Alessa away. She can't just kill Heather, though, because Heather contains Alessa. If she breaks Heather, she might also break Alessa. I think that the events of the entire game are set into motion by Claudia's desire to reclaim Alessa from Heather, and get her old source of affection, her sole source of love, back. Even killing Harry served an Alessa-themed purpose other than simple revenge. I mean, it was revenge, I'm sure she enjoyed it, but it was also intended to provide the god inside of Heather, Alessa, with some tasty, delicious, oh-so-nourishing hatred. Claudia's faith is the most corrosive thing about her. It's centered in a lifetime of pain and delusion, and she uses it to justify some incredibly horrific actions. Of course, she's convinced herself that by bringing God into the world, she's saving it from cruelty and pain and sin. But it's more than a little sus when it's made clear that, spoiler alert, the image that God will take is Alessa. I wonder if she's desperately trying to undo reality in order to bring back her weird sister girlfriend for selfish rather than altruistic purposes. It's a mystery. Nah, the whole saving the world thing is just a rationalization. She hates the world, just like she hated her father, and I doubt she cares much what happens to it or the people in it after being reunited with the person who symbolizes Claudia's only love. She wants to bring all of this about so she can get revenge on those who wronged her and get Alessa back. She wants paradise for herself, and if it works out so that everyone else gets paradise, fine. If it's actually some kinda twisted hell for everyone else, that's fine too, as long as Claudia gets Alessa back. She's of course so blinded by this questionable goal that she's failed to ask herself one very serious question. Is the god that Silent Hill generates actually the image of God the summoner holds in their mind, or does it just take that form? Is it in reality some kind of twisted, malevolent devil? Guess it doesn't really matter when God is so incredibly vulnerable to completely normal firearms. You know, a thing there are more of on Earth than people, well, at least in some countries. I think what actually remains of Alessa is Heather. People grow over time as they have different experiences and ideally don't stand still as thinking, feeling beings. By the end of the game, Heather is just Alessa after growing up and having different life experiences. I don't think the god would be Alessa at all, regardless of the image it takes. And I think this because you feed the thing hatred. Claudia could figure this all out if she wasn't so damaged and delusional and fixated on getting her friend back so she can feel the love of another human being again. The whole thing is incredibly tragic. Claudia is tragic. A victim who ends up victimizing others, as is sadly so common among those who've suffered childhood abuse. It's an example of the cycle of abuse in action. She's an incredibly interesting character, and my favorite part of this game has been trying to dig deeper into her motivations and how she became what she is. I feel sorry for her. I think she's incredibly dangerous, short-sighted, and misguided, but I still can't help but feel bad for her. I know she's a fictional character, but there are tons of people just like her in real life. One of my parents is one of them. Only, they're just obsessed with nonsense and don't have access to an actual font of dark power like the Thinny in Silent Hill. If Heather will never be home again, Claudia has never known anything bearing even a passing resemblance to home. To me, this is the strongest of the many contrasting elements in the game. Claudia was raised by a monster who is willing to help Heather murder her in the end. Raised by a monster and a cult in a cursed town that routinely calls out to and then eats people with darkness in their hearts. Heather was raised by her loving adopted father Harry, who pulled her out of the darkness and raised her like a normal person. Heather, like Vincent, has seen the pleasures, the love in this world and wants to find her happiness on Earth. That's why she doesn't believe the same as the people in Silent Hill. She doesn't need some god to bring her happiness. She already had it, until Claudia and her cult took it from her. Claudia's story is so interesting because what happened to her happens to real people every single day. They're abused to the point of retreating to some delusional fantasy world that gets reinforced the more they suffer. She's an archetype, a dog that was beaten until it went crazy and became mean. Heather heads back to her motel room looking for Douglas, but finds Vincent instead, who, like he did before, points her towards the next part of the game. That seems to be Vincent's role as far as the story is concerned. He's a signpost, just one that points Heather where he wants her to go next instead of where Claudia wants her to go next. He's in this for himself and wants to use Heather to further his own goals, which he's made explicitly clear don't align with Claudia's. He wants to stick around and experience earthly pleasures, remember? The next place he wants Heather to go is the church, but she's got to go through the amusement park to get there. The same amusement park as the nightmare Heather had at the very beginning of the game. After another nostalgic trip through Silent Hill, Heather arrives at the park, which is pretty much exactly the same layout as in her dream. She follows the same path and eventually walks the roller coaster tracks once again, but jumps off instead of getting smushed this time. This is where her dream ended though, so her advantage is run out. She's on her own again. The amusement park is an interesting area, but less creepy than the hospital. I like the haunted mansion bit, but because it's fun, not frightening. The voice actor who does the narration here is pretty great.
It's all just a joke. I wanted to scare you, that's all.
While Heather is experiencing spooktastic thrills in the horror house, Douglas is busy confronting his old employer. It doesn't go so well, and Heather finds Douglas lying on the ground with a broken leg. I think he probably got off lucky considering what happened to Harry. Douglas gets fleshed out a bit more here. We find out he's helping Heather because she reminds him of his son, who was shot to death during a bank robbery. His bank robbery. As in, he was the robber and got shot to death presumably by the police. The implications of this aren't lost on Heather, who nonetheless doesn't change her path whatsoever. She still seems committed to finding and killing Claudia. As she walks off, Douglas points his gun at her, which she seems to sense, asking him what he's doing. He says that killing her might be the only way to end this. Heather says, "You might be right," and continues to walk away without turning back. Douglas has become a voice of reason here, a sort of substitute for Harry, who doesn't want to help Heather kill Claudia so much as maybe take that darkness onto himself and help Heather return to the light. Unfortunately, in his injured state, he's run out of avenues in which to do this. Heather is now truly alone as she ventures into the next part of the amusement park, and reaches the newest entry in a lengthening list of rotating metal thingies that symbolize time and rebirth. A merry-go-round with rotting, deformed horses. Horses that Heather has to kill before meeting the most interesting boss monster of the game, the image of Alessa. The Book of Lost Memories describes this being as Alessa's obsession and Alessa's other mind. This is the part of Alessa that was trapped in the hospital, disfigured by burns received during a ritual performed by her own mother. This is the part of Alessa that could have become Claudia if it wasn't trapped in this time and space. This is also pretty much the spot where Harry helped Dahlia trap Alessa in the first game. Harry fought and possibly saved Sybil, the motorcycle cop from Silent Hill 1, on the same merry-go-round. And now, Heather has to fight the otherworld version of a part of herself. The fight is longer than the other boss fights, with the image returning to life multiple times before finally going down for good. This likely symbolizes Heather beating some of Alessa's darker personality traits into submission. Like I said, this is the part of Alessa that could have become someone similar to Claudia. Despite being sacrificed by her mom to birth a god, her reincarnation was saved by Harry and given something Claudia, or Model 1 Alessa, never got. The opportunity to go have a life filled with love in the real world, away from the darkness and madness of Silent Hill and the Order. Thanks to Harry, Model 3 Alessa got to go become an actual healthy, well-rounded person. Once she defeats her shadow self, an avatar of the darkness that likely opened the hole the town has been slipping into ever since, she goes on to find what Vincent called the Path of Heaven, and after entering the chapel, another important and telling cutscene with Claudia. As I've said repeatedly, Heather is Alessa, only without all her memories and after 17 years of character development. The only difference between Heather and Claudia is that Heather got to go live a real life and move on from her trauma, while Claudia was eternally stuck in hers, trapped by a combination of mental illness and the cult, which was pretty much the only social group she'd ever known. They say the main theme of Silent Hill 3 is motherhood, but there are also major themes here pertaining to trauma and loss, as well as how important parents are in general, how a good one can set you up for success and impart a healthy worldview, and how a bad one can break your brain and turn you into a monster, just like them. How the key difference between the two is love, and how crucial the presence of love is in the development of a child. When a child doesn't grow up with love, they'll seek it out wherever they can, and sometimes the place they try to find it will be extremely dangerous. Sometimes that place will be a hole that swallows them and then disappears. As soon as you enter the church, the second to last cutscene with Heather and Claudia plays. After a brief dialogue where Heather seems to channel Alessa, Claudia seems to finally accept that she is in fact her old friend, but refuses to give up her plan, still claiming that she needs God in order to end the suffering in the world. Claudia, realizing that Alessa, while present in Heather, has changed and she probably won't be able to get her back, clings desperately to the idea that God must be born in order to stop the people in the world from suffering. I still think she's using the saving the world thing as cover, and she just wants her suffering to end and to reclaim the version of Alessa that she loved. Heather reminds her that suffering is just a part of life. You can't escape it. It's a fool's errand, the way a child thinks. But Claudia is too far gone to stop now. She's still hopeful that the God she summons will be the old Alessa, her friend Alessa, the real Alessa. Heather is right about this, of course. Without at least some suffering, you wouldn't even know you were experiencing paradise. Because paradise lasts forever, and there would be nothing to compare it to. After a while, your memories of the real world would gloss over and fade around the edges, perhaps completely disappear. With enough time, endless bliss would just become boring. The only true end to suffering is death and oblivion, and you have to suffer a lot for a long time to start seeing that as a preferable outcome. At this point, there are two possibilities. Either Claudia expects to get Alessa back in the form of God. She knows that the God Dahlia brought forth took the form of her mental image of God, and so doesn't care about the Heather form of Alessa, believing that God will be her Alessa. Or she's given up on getting Alessa back entirely, realizing that Alessa had grown into Heather, and just wants to go through with her stated goal of bringing about paradise, because she doesn't know what else to do, and that would at least end her pain and maybe save the world, right? The second one involves Claudia having at heart altruistic intentions, however, so I tend to think that she knows that God can take the form of Alessa. At this point, she is becoming aware of how much of a mess she's created, and that everything is spiraling out of her control. But then Heather falls to the ground, clutching her stomach. Claudia confirms that Heather does in fact still despise her, that Heather's still feeding God with hatred, and slinks away, deeper into the church, as Heather experiences what seems to be a contraction. The church is the final area of the game, and multiple blanks get filled in as you wander the area. The first thing of note is a woman's voice in the confession booth. There's a lot of speculation as to this woman's identity. Many believe it's Dahlia from Silent Hill 1, but that doesn't seem to fit. Dahlia was absolutely insane and cruel, and the woman in the confessional refers to the girl she killed in a non-familial way. She doesn't say she killed her daughter at all, and Dahlia didn't do anything for revenge in the first game. She was simply trying to summon God. If it's a character found anywhere else in Silent Hill 3, it's probably the woman Vincent is talking to a bit later on a cassette tape found in the church. But that's just wild speculation on my part. I think it's just another way to tell you that revenge solves nothing. Heather forgiving her, or not, is a way to get the player to consider forgiveness instead of revenge. Your decision also contributes a lot to an alternate ending you can get on a second playthrough. We run into Vincent again in the library, where we finally learn a bit more about his motivations, and deeper into the church, more about his role in the Order. Vincent reiterates that he is a believer, but doesn't want God to be summoned. You see, he's been embezzling money from both the church and its devotees, which shines some light on those pleasures he's apparently all about. Of course he doesn't want the world to end. He has an undisclosed amount of money stashed away, and there's a whole planet full of dubious pleasures to be bought with his unearned riches. Despite this, he accuses Heather of being the worst person present because she enjoys killing the monsters, who, shocker, are only monsters through Heather's eyes. They look entirely different to Vincent, but he doesn't let us in on whatever form they take for him, so the only real information is that he's surprised they look like monsters for Heather. He also reveals why he sent Heather after Leonard. The seal Leonard dropped, the seal of Metatron, is apparently needed if they're going to stop Claudia from being able to summon God. As he leaves, he assures her that as long as she has the seal, they're fine. As Heather proceeds deeper into the church, she finds strange scenes from both her own life with Harry and Alessa's before she was reincarnated. She finds a version of Harry's bedroom with Harry's diary, detailing his feelings about raising the Impossibaby, which is pretty wholesome and confirms that Harry is indeed a good person and a good father. We also find a scene from the school in the first game, Alessa's vandalized desk, complete with scratched-in insults and threats from other students. Also, a letter from a teacher discussing the possibility that Alessa is being abused at home. Deeper still, we find Alessa's old bedroom with crayon drawings that seem to be the inspiration for several monsters found in the series, including the Closers, which confirmed that Heather is indeed projecting her own imaginings of monsters over whatever the creatures found in Silent Hill are, whether real people or things of the other world. And at last, we find Claudia's bedroom. There's a diary here that alludes to an earlier version of Claudia. This is from when she first found out that Alessa's reincarnation was alive and had been found, before she had committed herself to her current path and decided she had to bring on Paradise. It seems to confirm that her true motivation was wanting to see Alessa again. I think this was the first and most important piece of the puzzle, and she kind of filled in the gaps with the whole end-of-the-world Paradise thing. Ultimately, she did it all because she wanted to see her one true friend again. As further evidence of this, you find a birthday card on her table from Alessa back when they were friends. In it, Alessa tells Claudia that she's her real sister and proves that there was true affection between the two girls. It makes everything that precedes that much sadder. After collecting a series of tarot cards from around the church, Heather opens one final door and the last cutscene before the conclusion of the game plays out. It begins with Victor and Claudia arguing once again. Victor confirms that Claudia is the one bringing the otherworld into existence, and the creatures are just whatever the subconscious of the person viewing them interprets them as. He says that their surroundings are her personal hell, just like what Alessa did, referring to the events of the first game where it was the burned and desperate Alessa pulling the otherworld into reality. This also confirms that Claudia has found a way to bring the otherworld with her outside of Silent Hill. That transfiguration of reality seems to be the power that the Book of Lost Memories refers to her having. Heather arrives and Victor urges her to kill Claudia, but Claudia sticks a knife in his back. At this point, she does seem to be completely focused on bringing God forth, not to get Alessa back. She's finally lost faith in her plan and fully expects to go to hell herself, as a kind of acknowledgement of the sin she's committed by putting these events into motion. She is, however, still completely committed to following through with bringing God forth and creating paradise and blah blah religious zealot stuff. Heather/Alessa is racked once again with contractions and falls to her knees, her skin turning blood red as God tries to take control of her and come into being. Heather fights it back one last time, giving the player control once again. Here, you can choose to shoot Alessa, ending the game and assumedly feeding God the last of the hatred needed to bring it into being, or you can eat the little red pill in the necklace Harry gave her, that we've been carrying around all game, and vomit up the fetal form of God that Heather has assumedly been carrying inside of her since Dahlia put it into Alessa during the ritual that burned her and split her soul into two pieces before the events of the first game. Seeing what has happened, Claudia panics and eats the fetal image herself and begins to merge with it, her skin now turning blood red. She goes to pray or something near a hole that's been behind her during these events and is pulled into said hole by Valtiel, which leaves a gash in the floor that bears more than a passing resemblance to female genitalia. Once she gets yanked into the hole that becomes a womb of sorts by Valtiel, she succeeds in manifesting God, kinda, and comes to resemble a monstrous version of Alessa. Not the incubus of the first game or some other demonic or angelic entity. Her version of God is merely her best friend, her sister. This was a woman whose obsession has consumed the last years of her life. Again, according to the Book of Lost Memories, the reason God manifests as the demonic incubus in the first game is because that was Dahlia's mental image of God. The same is true for Claudia's version of God being Alessa. It's that simple. To Claudia, whether she admitted it to herself or not, Alessa was always her version of God. She loved her and would do anything to have her back. She didn't see Heather as Alessa until the very end, merely something that contained Alessa, something she had to crack open and bring her friend back out of. Only her own self-deception, nurtured by the town and the cult in which she was raised, misled her. Claudia is the James Sunderland of Silent Hill 3, the character operating from a place of utter delusion. James is brought into the town to find a woman that, in actuality, he killed himself. He's brought to Silent Hill to learn the truth and shatter the delusion, and be eaten by the town, I guess. Claudia is sent out from the town, believing she will save the world, but in actuality she would be killing the only form remaining to her best friend, Heather. More contrasts. In the end, thwarted by Harry once again in the form of the pendant he gave Heather, she eats the god and turns into her mental image of her friend. Silent Hill is a weird series. There's a lot of speculation on what the god of Silent Hill truly is, and so far I've yet to hear a solid answer. But considering how God's form changes depending on who brings it forth, I'd say a valid interpretation is that God is whatever you want it to be, but with a monkey's paw style evil twist. God is formed by a dark wish, nursed by hatred, and given specific form. She must have known eating the fetus wouldn't work. She failed to imbue Heather with the hatred she believed necessary to feed God. Instead, by eating it, she may have imbued it with her love of Alessa and her panic at realizing she had failed and would never get to see her friend again, in paradise or otherwise. Because of this incomplete summoning, or perhaps the drug in the pendant, which is the same thing that was thrown on God in Silent Hill 1 before the final battle, God is misshapen and cannot walk, and like the god Harry took down years ago, able to be killed with normal gunfire. It's also notable that the Alessa god attacks with fire, as if the burning her mother had imparted became an intrinsic aspect of at least Claudia's perception of her. The town of Silent Hill has failed once again in bringing whatever lurks on the other side of the thinny into our material reality at full strength. Heather makes short work of it, and after falling to her knees and allowing herself to finally grieve for her father, heads back to the amusement park to make sure Douglas is still alright. By the time she returns to Douglas in the park, Heather's entire demeanor has shifted. She's cheerful and goofy, opening with a joke about returning to kill Douglas, which takes on a darker connotation if you play through a second time and get the possessed ending. But we're talking canon endings here. This is the first and only time in the game that we see her happy, and when Douglas calls her Heather, she corrects him, saying that since she isn't hiding anymore, he should use her real name, Cheryl, what her father named her. The credits roll over a still image of her kneeling over her father's tombstone. Most people familiar with Team Silent know that Silent Hill 3 had a bit of a troubled production. It's arguably the last true game in the series, as Silent Hill 4 The Room was produced simultaneously and by what could be described as the B team. I still count it though. Silent Hill 3 is not without its problems, and I know I've more or less avoided talking about them here. This is because I don't go into these videos with any set plan of what I'm going to do or how I'm going to approach. I more or less just start writing and see what grabs me. In this game, it was the characters, especially Claudia Wolf. Shockingly, I tend to be nicer to games that I enjoy. If you've made it this far, please consider subscribing to the channel. Thanks again to producer Janelle for chipping in her 2 cents, and welcome to our new producer Brian, who helped to workshop a few lines. Producers here just refer to friends of mine who helped me out in some way during production. Thanks again to everyone who spent over an hour listening to me ramble about an old video game.
Killing. Now that sounds like your first good idea.